Eleanor Brooks slammed the leather ledger down on Thomas Whitaker's desk so hard the oil lamp shook. "You are bleeding to death," she said, her voice low and steady. "And you don't even know it." Thomas looked up from his chair. He had married this woman 3 weeks ago. He had told her clearly what her role was. Cook, clean, keep the house. He had not asked for this. He had not asked for her. But Eleanor was already pointing at the numbers, and what she showed him made his stomach drop. If this story already has your heart racing, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Before we go any further, please take a moment and subscribe to this channel. Hit that bell so you never miss a story. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what Eleanor did to that ledger, you have to understand what kind of woman would dare do it in the first place. Thomas Whitaker had never been a man who believed in wasting time. He was 41 years old, lean and weathered from 17 years of working Kansas cattle land, and he had built the Whitaker Ranch with nothing but a deed his father left him and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that passed for strength in men who didn't know what else to call it. He had buried a wife 8 years before. Fever took her in the spring of 1878. And he had told himself then that he would not marry again. He had managed. The ranch had managed. But by the winter of 1885, manage was no longer enough. The cattle market had dropped. 3 of his best workers had left for better wages in Colorado. The supplier he'd been depending on for grain and livestock feed had tripled his rates without explanation and without apology. Thomas had watched his accounts drain the way a man watches water disappear from a cracked barrel. Slowly at first, then all at once. He was not a man who asked for help, but he was smart enough to know that a ranch needed a household, and a household without a woman running it was like a fire without fuel. It burned through everything and left nothing useful behind. So he made a practical decision. He needed a wife. Not a woman who wanted romance. Not a woman who had opinions about cattle pricing or land management or the way he ran his operation. Not a woman who would sit at his dinner table and tell him what he was doing wrong. He needed someone who could organize his kitchen, feed his workers, keep the supply costs from hemorrhaging, and allow him to focus on what actually mattered, keeping 23 head of cattle alive through another Kansas winter. He asked the minister in Caldwell. The minister told him about Eleanor Brooks. "She's a good woman," Reverend Hayward said carefully, which Thomas immediately recognized as the kind of thing men said when they were trying to prepare you for something you hadn't expected. "She's capable," the Reverend continued. "Hard-working, strong, comes from good family, managed her mother's boarding house for 6 years." "How old?" Thomas asked. 28. "Why isn't she married?" The Reverend paused. "Men are foolish," he said finally. "That's the only honest answer I have for you." Thomas had met Eleanor Brooks for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon outside the dry goods store in Caldwell. She was loading flour sacks into a small wagon with the kind of unhurried efficiency that told him immediately she had done it 1,000 times before. She was a big woman, broad-shouldered, full-figured, with strong arms and a solid, grounded way of moving that reminded him of women who had spent their lives doing real work rather than performing it. Her brown hair was pinned back neatly beneath a plain bonnet. Her cotton dress was clean but worn at the hem. She looked up when she heard his boots on the boards. She did not smile first. She did not look away. She simply met his eyes with a calm, level gaze that belonged to someone who had long ago stopped waiting for people to decide how they felt about her before she decided how she felt about herself. "You're the rancher," she said. It wasn't a question. "Thomas Whitaker," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." "Eleanor Brooks," she said. She set down the flour sack she was holding and wiped her hands on her apron. "The Reverend told me you'd be coming." "He told me about you too," Thomas said. "I imagine he was diplomatic," Eleanor said. "He said you were capable." "He was diplomatic," she said again, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but contained everything a smile would have. Thomas looked at her. He was not a man given to long conversations. He had learned over the years that most things could be said plainly, and that people who used too many words were usually trying to hide the ones that mattered. "I have a working ranch," he said. 23 head of cattle, 6 workers, house needs managing, pantry needs organizing. I need someone who can handle a household budget and keep the kitchen running through winter." "And in exchange," Eleanor said, "room, board, a fair household allowance, and my name," Thomas said. "I'm not offering more than that." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she is deciding not what kind of man he is, but what kind of man he is capable of becoming. "I'll need to see the ranch before I agree," she said. Thomas blinked. That was not the answer he had expected. "Most women just—" "I'm not most women," Eleanor said simply. "If you want me to run your household, I need to see what I'm running. That's not a demand, it's just sense." He took her out to the Whitaker Ranch that same afternoon. She walked through the house without touching anything. She looked at the pantry. She opened the kitchen cabinet. She asked him how many meals a day the workers expected. She asked what he currently paid for grain and flour and salt pork. She asked when the roof had last been patched on the smokehouse. Thomas answered every question, growing more uncomfortable with each one. Not because the questions were unreasonable, but because he realized, answering them, that he didn't always know the answers as well as he should have. When they were done, Eleanor stood on the porch and was quiet for a long moment. "You're losing money in the kitchen," she said. "The kitchen?" Thomas said. "You're paying Hargrove's supply company almost 40% more than you should be for dry goods," she said. "I can see it in what you have on those shelves. You've got 3 different sizes of the same type of salt barrel, which tells me someone's been buying without a system. Your smokehouse is wasting meat because the patches on that roof are letting moisture in. And your workers are eating badly, which means they're not working as well as they could." Thomas stared at her. "I came out here to look at a house," he said. "You came out here to find someone to fix your problems," Eleanor said, and her voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't soft either. "I'm just telling you where some of them are." He married her 3 weeks later. The ceremony was short. The minister read the words. Thomas said what he was supposed to say. Eleanor said what she was supposed to say. There were no flowers. There were no guests except the minister's wife and one of Thomas's older ranch hands, a man named Walt Greer, who had worked the Whitaker land for 9 years, and who stood in the back of the small church with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Thomas couldn't quite read. Afterward, as they rode back to the ranch in the wagon, Thomas said what he had decided needed to be said clearly. "I want you to understand what this is," he told her. "I need a good wife who keeps the house. That's what I can offer you. I'm not looking for anything more than that." Eleanor kept her eyes on the road ahead. "And what happens," she said slowly, "if keeping the house is not all I can do?" Thomas frowned. "I don't follow." "Oh, I know," she said, and she said nothing more. He had assumed, in the days that followed, that she would settle into the role he had outlined, that she would find her place in the kitchen and the pantry and the domestic landscape of the Whitaker house, and stay there, quiet and competent and invisible in the way that useful things often are. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about almost everything. The first thing Eleanor did when she arrived was ask Thomas for a complete list of every regular expense associated with feeding the ranch. Thomas gave it to her reluctantly, as though handing over a personal document he hadn't intended anyone to read. She sat at the kitchen table that evening with his papers spread in front of her, and she went through every line without asking for help or explanation. The second thing she did was reorganize the pantry from top to bottom. She threw away spoiled goods that had been sitting forgotten behind newer purchases, a waste that, when she tallied it, added up to nearly $12 over the past season alone. The third thing she did was start a ledger of her own. Not Thomas's ledger. Her own. A slim leather-bound book she had brought from her mother's boarding house, its pages already half filled with careful columns of numbers from years of managing someone else's household budget. Thomas noticed the ledger after the first week. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. The ranch hands noticed Eleanor too, though not in the way she had hoped at first. They noticed her size. They noticed the way she moved through the kitchen, the way she filled a doorframe when she stood in it, the way her skirts were wider than most women's who came through Caldwell. Cowboys had a particular cruelty that they didn't always recognize as cruelty. They called it humor, called it plain speaking, called it just the way things were out here. And Eleanor was not the first woman to walk into a working ranch and be weighed by men who thought they had the right to do the weighing. The youngest one, a boy of maybe 19 named Danny Croft, who had more mouth than sense, said it out loud the first morning. He said it under his breath, but loud enough to carry to the kitchen door, where Eleanor was already up and working before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. "Lord help us," he said to the man beside him. "The new missus is gonna eat the ranch's profits before old Whitaker gets a chance to." The other man, a quiet Texan named Holt Reeves, said nothing. But Eleanor heard it. She did not stop working. She did not come to the door. She did not raise her voice. She finished mixing the biscuit dough she had started before dawn, put the pan in the oven, and went back to her morning tasks without a single word. An hour later, Danny Croft sat down to breakfast and found in front of him the best biscuits he had ever eaten in his life. Light. Buttery. Still pulling heat from the oven. The kind of biscuits that made a man close his eyes when he took the first bite. Nobody said anything, but Danny's ears went red, and he ate 3 of them without once looking up from his plate. Walt Greer, sitting at the far end of the table, watched Eleanor carry the second pan out of the kitchen and set it down with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to everything. "Ma'am," he said, and he said it the way men of a certain generation said it. Not as courtesy exactly, but as acknowledgement. As recognition of someone whose quality they had just been forced to reckon with. "Mr. Greer," Eleanor said. She went back to the kitchen. Thomas ate his breakfast and said nothing, but he watched Eleanor move through the room the way a man watches something that has surprised him and isn't quite ready to say so out loud. The weeks passed. Eleanor learned the ranch the way she had learned her mother's boarding house, not by being told, but by watching and asking and working until she understood it from the inside out. She learned when the workers ate and what they needed. She learned which supplies were being over-ordered and which were running short before anyone noticed. She learned that the man Thomas paid to haul water from the creek twice a week was charging him almost double what the job was worth, because Thomas had never thought to ask whether the rate was fair, and the man had never seen any reason to volunteer the information. She fixed it. Not dramatically, not in a way that called attention to herself. She simply started making different arrangements, one at a time, without asking Thomas's permission for every decision, because she had learned in 6 years of running her mother's boarding house that asking permission for every small correction was how you buried yourself in someone else's approval before you had a chance to actually help them. Thomas noticed the changes. He noticed that the kitchen was costing less. He noticed that the workers were eating better, and, whether or not he connected the two facts, which he did not yet, were working harder. He noticed that the smokehouse repairs Eleanor had quietly arranged with one of the ranch hands had stopped the moisture problem she'd identified on her first walkthrough of the property. He noticed all of it, and he said nothing, because to say something would have required him to acknowledge that his wife was doing things he hadn't asked her to do, and that those things were, undeniably, making his operation run better. And Thomas Whitaker was a man who found acknowledgement difficult when it meant admitting he had been wrong about something. The confrontation, when it came, arrived the way most real confrontations do. Not with a dramatic announcement, but in the middle of an ordinary evening. Eleanor had placed her ledger on his desk. Not asked, not requested permission. Placed it there, the way you place something that belongs in a room. Thomas looked at it. He looked at her. "What is this?" he said. "An accounting," Eleanor said. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited, which was already more than he was prepared for. "Of the household expenses for the past 6 weeks, and a comparison to what you were spending in the 6 weeks before I arrived." Thomas did not open the ledger. "I have my own accounts." "I know," Eleanor said. "I've seen them." "You've—" He stopped. He sat very still. "When did you go through my accounts?" "You left them on the kitchen table when you came in from riding 3 weeks ago," Eleanor said. "You didn't put them away." "I wasn't snooping, Thomas. I was clearing the table for supper." He stared at her. "And you read them." "I understand numbers," Eleanor said. I couldn't not read them. It would be like setting a carpenter in front of a broken joint and asking him to ignore it. Thomas leaned back in his chair. His jaw was tight. You should have told me. I'm telling you now, Eleanor said. And what I'm telling you is that you have a problem that is more serious than the cattle prices and the dry summer, and it is sitting in your supply contracts. My supply contracts are my business. Your supply contracts are bleeding you, Eleanor said. Hargrove has been overcharging you for 18 months. I can show you the numbers line by line. He knows you don't track it closely because you're focused on the cattle, and he's taken advantage of that. Thomas was silent. Not the silence of a man who had nothing to say. The silence of a man who was hearing something he had been too proud or too busy to see, and who did not yet know how to hold the truth of it, alongside the idea that it had taken a woman he had hired to keep his kitchen to show it to him. You are my wife, he said finally. His voice was controlled. I did not ask you to run my business. Eleanor looked at him. No, she said. You asked me to keep your house. She did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. I am showing you that a home is more than walls and a kitchen, and a wife is more than someone who makes sure supper is on the table. She stood. She left the ledger on his desk. She walked out of the study and back to the kitchen where the last of the evening bread was cooling on the counter, and she did not look back. Thomas sat alone at his desk for a long time after that. He did not open the ledger that night, but he did not put it away either. He left it exactly where Eleanor had placed it, and sometime in the small hours of the morning, when the house was quiet and the ranch was dark around him, he reached out and opened it, and what he read there kept him awake until dawn. Because Eleanor had not just tracked the household expenses, she had reconstructed his supply history from the receipts she'd found in the kitchen drawer, receipts Thomas had shoved there and forgotten about, and compared them against the standard rates she knew from years of purchasing for her mother's boarding house. She had laid out, in clear and careful columns, exactly how much money had left the Whitaker Ranch over the past 18 months and gone into Calvin Hargrove's pocket instead of staying where it belonged. The number was larger than Thomas had been prepared for. Much larger. He sat with it in the dark, and for the first time in a long time, Thomas Whitaker felt something he was not accustomed to feeling. He felt afraid. Not of Hargrove. He would deal with Hargrove. Afraid of what he had been missing. Afraid of how long he had been missing it. Afraid of what that meant about the years behind him and the assumptions he had built his life on. That he knew his land, that he knew his business, that he was the kind of man who did not need help seeing what was in front of him. In the morning, he came to the kitchen before the ranch hands were up. Eleanor was already there. She was always already there. She was making bread. A different recipe from the biscuits, something slower and more deliberate, something that filled the kitchen with a warmth that reached him before he even stepped through the door. He stood in the doorway and watched her work for a moment. Then he said, "The number is worse than I thought." Eleanor did not stop working. "I know," she said. "You could have led with that." "You wouldn't have heard it," she said. "You needed to see it yourself." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You've done this before," he said. "This kind of accounting. This kind of tracking." 6 years at my mother's boarding house, Eleanor said. She turned the dough once, firmly, with the heels of her hands. "We had 14 guests at our peak, and a budget that would make yours look generous. I learned how to make every cent work." "Why didn't you tell me that when we met?" Eleanor looked up at him then. "Because you didn't ask," she said. "You asked if I could keep your house. You told me what you needed. You gave me a list of duties. And in that whole conversation, Thomas, you never once asked who I was." The words landed quietly. Thomas felt them land. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me a conversation," Eleanor said. "The apology can come later." She went back to her bread. Thomas sat down at the kitchen table. His own kitchen table, which he rarely sat at, preferring the formality of his office or the distance of the range. And he sat there for an hour while Eleanor worked, and they talked. Not about the ranch, not about the ledger, about her, about who she was and where she had come from, and what she had learned in 28 years of being underestimated by people who thought her body told the whole story of what she was. She told him about her grandmother's bread recipe, about the way her grandmother had run a household of 7 on next to nothing, and how she had made that nothing feel like enough through sheer force of love and intelligence, and a refusal to waste a single thing the world gave her. Thomas listened in a way he had not listened to another person in a long time, and when Eleanor finally slid the first loaf from the oven and cut him a slice without asking whether he wanted one, he took it and ate it, standing at his own kitchen counter. It was the best bread he had ever had in his life. Not because of the flour or the recipe or the skill, though the skill was real. Because of what it meant. Because a woman who had every reason to be angry with him, every reason to retreat into the small role he had assigned her, and do exactly what he'd asked, and nothing more. That woman had instead stayed up before dawn to make something extraordinary in a kitchen she had not been welcomed into so much as pointed toward. He looked down at the bread in his hands. "Eleanor," he said. "Thomas," she said, and there was something in the way she said his name. Not soft exactly, not warm exactly, but patient, that told him she had been waiting for this moment longer than he had realized. "I think," he said slowly, "I may have made some mistakes." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "but you're here now." And for the first time since she had walked through the door of the Whitaker Ranch, Thomas Whitaker looked at his wife, really looked at her, and understood that he had been given something far more valuable than a woman who could keep his house. He just didn't know yet how much it was going to cost him to prove he deserved her. The morning after Thomas sat at his own kitchen table and actually listened to his wife for the first time, everything on the Whitaker Ranch looked the same. The cattle were in the same pasture. The barn needed the same repairs it had needed for 2 years. Walt Greer was up before sunrise doing the same checks he had done every morning for 9 years. Danny Croft was complaining about the cold in the same way he complained about everything, loudly, to no one in particular, as if the universe owed him better weather. Everything looked the same. But something had shifted. Thomas felt it the moment he walked out of the house that morning. He couldn't have named it exactly. It wasn't peace. It wasn't resolution. It was more like the feeling a man gets when he's been walking with a stone in his boot for so long he forgot it was there, and then someone points it out, and suddenly he can feel nothing else. He had a problem with Calvin Hargrove. He had known that Hargrove was a difficult man. Everybody in Caldwell knew that. Hargrove ran the largest supply operation between Dodge City and the Colorado border, and he had built that operation the way certain men build things, not through quality or fairness, but through positioning. He put himself between ranchers and their options until the ranchers believed they didn't have any. He was the kind of businessman who smiled at you while he counted money that should have stayed in your pocket. Thomas had done business with Hargrove for 7 years. He had never looked closely enough at the numbers. Eleanor had looked at them for 6 weeks and built him a case he couldn't argue with. He rode into Caldwell that morning without telling anyone where he was going. He left before breakfast, which was unusual enough that Walt noticed it and said nothing, which was the way Walt handled most things he noticed. Hargrove's supply office was on the main street, between the bank and the feed store. It was a wide, low building with a painted sign above the door that said, Hargrove Supply and Trade, in letters that were a little too large for the building, which was the kind of detail Thomas had never thought about before, but thought about now. Calvin Hargrove was behind his counter when Thomas walked in. He was a big man, well-fed, with a face that had settled into a permanent expression of easy confidence that Thomas now recognized as the face of a man who had never been seriously questioned. "Thomas," Hargrove said, and he smiled. "Good to see you. Early morning for a ranch call." "I need to talk to you about my supply contracts," Thomas said. He didn't take off his hat. He didn't sit down in the chair Hargrove gestured toward. He stood at the counter and put Eleanor's numbers on the wood surface between them. Hargrove looked at the paper. The smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "What's this?" Hargrove said. 18 months of your invoices," Thomas said, "compared against the standard market rate for every item you've been selling me. Where did you get these numbers?" "My wife," Thomas said. Something crossed Hargrove's face that Thomas couldn't quite name. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was closer to the expression of a man who has been winning a card game and has just realized someone at the table has been counting. Your wife, Hargrove repeated. She ran a boarding house for 6 years, Thomas said. She knows what things cost. And what I've been paying you for dry goods, grain, and salt pork does not match what things cost, Calvin. Not even close. Hargrove picked up the paper. He looked at it for a long moment. These numbers aren't accurate, he said. Which ones? Thomas said. All of them. Pick one, Thomas said. Tell me which line is wrong. I'll wait. The silence that followed was long enough to tell Thomas everything he needed to know. Hargrove set the paper down. Prices go up, he said. Costs of transportation, storage. At 40% above market rate? Thomas said. For a year and a half? Thomas, we have a relationship. We have a contract, Thomas said. And I want it renegotiated, starting with the next order. He tapped the paper. These are the numbers my wife calculated as fair. I want you to look at them and tell me which ones you can meet. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Thomas left with a new agreement. It wasn't everything Eleanor's numbers had called for. Hargrove pushed back hard on 3 of the line items and had enough leverage with the local transportation routes that Thomas couldn't squeeze him all the way down. But it was significantly better than what he'd been paying. Enough better that when he rode back to the ranch and did the math in his head, he could feel the difference it would make by spring. He walked into the kitchen when he got home. Eleanor was at the stove. She looked up at him when he came through the door, read his face the way she was already learning to read him, and said nothing for a moment. "How did it go?" she asked. "Better than it should have," Thomas said. "Worse than your numbers said it could." He pushed back on the grain pricing, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know that?" "Because the grain is where he has the most leverage," she said. "He controls the 2 closest storage facilities. You don't have a good alternative right now." She turned back to the stove. "But you will by summer if we build the back storage shed I mentioned." Thomas stared at her. "You mentioned that once," he said. "In passing, 3 weeks ago." "I mention things I mean," Eleanor said. He stood there for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he said, "You did good work on those numbers." Eleanor didn't make a production of it. She didn't turn around to look at him. She just said, "I know." In the same tone she said everything. Level, certain, without apology for the certainty. It was the first time Thomas had complimented her on anything that wasn't the bread. It landed differently than she expected it to. She kept her back to him so he wouldn't see her face. The ranch hands learned about the Hargrove confrontation, the way ranch hands always learned about things. Through Walt, who had seen Thomas ride out that morning and had put the pieces together by afternoon. By supper time, there was a low current of something different running through the table. Nobody said anything directly, but the quality of the silence changed. It was the silence of men who were reassessing. Danny Croft was the one who finally broke it, which was appropriate because Danny was always the one who broke things. "Heard you went to see Hargrove this morning," he said to Thomas. "I did," Thomas said. "Heard you brought him numbers." "I did." "Miss Eleanor's numbers?" Thomas looked at him across the table. "They were correct numbers," he said. "That's what mattered." Danny opened his mouth. Walt Greer looked at him from the end of the table. Danny closed his mouth. It was, Eleanor thought from the kitchen doorway, where she had paused with a serving dish in her hands, one of the most useful things she had ever seen Walt Greer do. She went back to the kitchen before anyone noticed she had been standing there, but she was smiling. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they had a different quality than the weeks before. Thomas did not suddenly become a man who shared his decisions. He was too long in his habits for that. But he stopped closing his office door when he was working on accounts, and twice Eleanor caught him looking at her ledger, not hiding that he was looking, which was its own kind of progress. She did not push. She had learned, in her mother's boarding house, that people changed the way seasons changed. Not because you demanded it, but because the conditions finally made it possible. You could not force a spring. You could only make sure that when it came, you were ready. She had not told Thomas about the bread yet. Not the full truth of it. He knew she baked. He knew the whole ranch knew she baked. He knew that the biscuits and the loaves and the preserves she had started putting up in the last weeks had become something the workers talked about. Walt Greer had told her quietly, one morning after the others had gone out, that Danny Croft had described her bread to his sister in a letter home as the best thing about this whole sorry winter, which was, Walt said, the closest Danny was ever likely to come to an apology. But what Thomas didn't know was that Eleanor had started selling it. Not much. Not yet. Just to a few households in Caldwell who had heard about it through the minister's wife, who had tasted Eleanor's preserves at a church gathering and had very directly asked where they could be purchased. And Eleanor, who had grown up in a boarding house where you did not waste an opportunity to build something sustainable out of whatever the world offered you, had said yes. She had told herself she would tell Thomas. She had been telling herself that for 3 weeks. The problem was not that she was afraid of his reaction. The problem was that she wanted to be further along first. She wanted to have something solid enough that when she laid it out for him, he could see it clearly. She had learned, in the conversation about Hargrove, that Thomas needed to see a thing completely before he could respond to it well. He was not a man for hypotheticals. He was a man for numbers on a page. She was building the numbers. She just needed a little more time. Time, as it turned out, was the one thing Calvin Hargrove had decided she was not going to get. She found out on a Thursday afternoon in late November, when Mrs. Paulson from the dry goods store stopped by the ranch on her way back from town and asked, in the careful, apologetic way that women delivered bad news in Caldwell, if Eleanor had heard what Calvin Hargrove had been saying. Eleanor had not heard. She sat down at the kitchen table while Mrs. Paulson told her. Hargrove had been telling people, apparently with some consistency over the past 2 weeks, that Eleanor Brooks Whitaker was running an unlicensed commercial kitchen operation out of her husband's ranch. He had framed it carefully, not as an accusation exactly, but as a concern. The kind of concern that had teeth in it. He had mentioned it to the county clerk. He had mentioned it to 2 of the men who sat on the informal business board that governed commercial activity in Caldwell. He's not technically wrong, Mrs. Paulson said unhappily. I mean, you are selling from the ranch kitchen, and you don't have a commercial license. Nobody really uses commercial licenses around here, but if someone makes a formal complaint, it becomes a formal problem, Eleanor said. Yes, Mrs. Paulson said. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Why is he doing this? Mrs. Paulson asked. You're not competition for him. You're selling bread and preserves. No, Eleanor said slowly. But I am the reason Thomas renegotiated his supply contract. And I am the reason Thomas is going to build his own storage shed and stop depending on Hargrove's facilities by summer. She looked at the table. I am the reason Hargrove is going to lose one of his most consistent accounts. Mrs. Paulson was quiet. He's not coming after your business, Eleanor said. He's coming after me to get to Thomas. She walked Mrs. Paulson to the door, thanked her for coming, and stood on the porch for a long time after the woman's wagon had disappeared down the road. Then she walked to Thomas's office and knocked. He opened the door. He looked at her face and said immediately, "What happened?" She told him. She told him all of it. Not just the Hargrove complaint, but the bread operation, the sales, the customers in Caldwell, everything she had been building over the past 3 weeks without telling him. She put it all on the table at once, the way she had put the ledger on his desk. Not asking for permission, but not hiding any more either. When she was done, Thomas was very still. How long have you been selling? He said. 3 weeks, Eleanor said. And you didn't tell me. No, she said. I was building it first. I didn't want to show you a seed. I wanted to show you a plant. Eleanor, I know, she said. I should have told you earlier. I'm telling you now because I don't have the choice anymore, and I won't pretend that's the same thing. But Thomas... She stopped. She took a breath. Whatever you think about how I handled this, you need to understand that Hargrove isn't doing this because I was running a kitchen operation. He's doing it because I threatened his business by helping yours, and if we let him shut this down, he wins twice. Thomas was silent for long enough that Eleanor could hear the wind picking up outside. How much? He said finally. What? How much have you made in 3 weeks? Eleanor blinked. That was not the question she had expected. $32, she said. Thomas looked at her. $32, he repeated. Mostly preserves, Eleanor said. The bread doesn't travel as well. But I've had 3 requests from the hotel in Caldwell for a standing weekly order, and if I— The hotel, Thomas said. Yes. They want a standing order. Yes. He was quiet again. But this time, it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of a man deciding whether to be angry. The silence of a man doing arithmetic. What would you need, he said slowly, to fill a standing order for the hotel and keep up with what you've already got going? Eleanor stared at him. Thomas? I'm asking a practical question, he said. What do you need? A proper oven, she said. The one we have now is adequate for household cooking, but it's too small for volume. And I'd need to hire someone to help during the heavy days, at least twice a week. And if we're going to make it legitimate, which we have to, if we're going to shut down Hargrove's complaint, we need to register a commercial license with the county, which costs $12 and takes about 2 weeks to process. Thomas nodded slowly. The $12 isn't a problem, he said. I'll ride to the county seat Monday. The oven— He paused. Walt's brother-in-law does metalwork in Wichita. He owes me a favor. I'll write him. Eleanor was very still. You're not angry, she said. I'm not happy you didn't tell me sooner, Thomas said. But I'm not going to pretend I gave you a lot of reasons to trust that I'd respond well. He met her eyes. You showed me what you could do with the household accounts. You showed me what you could do with Hargrove's numbers. Now you're showing me what you can build. He paused. How angry would I have to be to walk away from $32 in 3 weeks with a hotel order on the table? Eleanor almost laughed. She didn't. But the corner of her mouth moved in that way again. The way that wasn't quite a smile but held everything a smile would have. We still have the Hargrove problem, she said. We still have the Hargrove problem, Thomas agreed. But it's a different kind of problem now. It's a problem we're dealing with together. That word, together, landed somewhere in Eleanor's chest and stayed there. She had not expected it. She was not sure Thomas had expected to say it, but neither of them took it back. The following Monday, Thomas rode to the county seat and filed for a commercial kitchen license in the name of Whitaker Ranch Supply and Kitchen, with Eleanor Brooks Whitaker listed as primary operator. He did not tell Eleanor in advance that he was putting her name first on the license. She found out when he came home that evening and handed her the receipt. She looked at the receipt. She looked at him. You put my name first, she said. It's your operation, Thomas said. He was already heading toward the barn to see to his horse, and he said it the way he said most things, without ceremony, without asking for credit. And Eleanor stood on the porch, holding that receipt, and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. The license was filed. The commercial complaint Hargrove had raised with the county board was rendered moot. Hargrove had not expected that. He had expected Eleanor to either panic or wait too long, and he had not counted on Thomas moving as fast as he did. But what Hargrove had not finished with them yet. Walt Greer came to Thomas's office 3 days later with the look on his face that Walt only wore when he was carrying information he wished he wasn't. You'd better hear this from me before someone else tells you, Walt said. Thomas put down the paper he was holding. Walt told him that he had been in town the evening before and had run into Jeb Calloway, who ran a small operation about 8 miles east of the Whitaker Ranch, and who had been drinking more than was wise for a man who wanted to keep his business private. Calloway had been approached by Hargrove 2 weeks before. Hargrove had offered him a price on his land. Calloway had said no. And then Calloway, who was not a complicated man, had told Walt that he was only the latest in a series, that Hargrove had been making land offers to struggling ranchers all through the district for the better part of a year. How many? Thomas said. Jeb didn't know for certain, Walt said. But he said he knew of at least 4 others besides himself. Pearson, down south. The 2 brothers on the Cimarron tributary. And— He paused. The McReady widow. Thomas was quiet. He's building something, Thomas said. That's what Jeb thinks too, Walt said. Nobody knows what. But Jeb said Hargrove's been talking to some railroad men out of Wichita. Something about a spur line. Thomas sat very still. A railroad spur line through this part of Kansas would make the land it crossed worth 3 times what it was currently valued. A man who bought up enough of the right parcels before the route was announced. He needs the land before the announcement goes public, Thomas said. That's what it looks like, Walt said. Thomas pushed back from his desk. Get Eleanor, he said. Walt blinked. Ma'am Eleanor? She needs to hear this, Thomas said. Walt went and got her. Eleanor came into the office, still wiping her hands on her apron, and Thomas told her what Walt had told him. All of it, start to finish, without editing it or softening it or pre-chewing it the way men sometimes did when they decided women needed a simplified version of complicated things. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. He doesn't just want your supply business, she said. No, Thomas said. He wants your land. If the spur line comes through where I think it comes through based on what Jeb said, Thomas said, the Whitaker Ranch sits at the midpoint between two proposed junctions. This land would be worth... He needs you desperate, Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her. That's why he came after my kitchen operation, she said. Not because of the supply contract. The supply contract was just the beginning. He's been trying to make your situation worse. Keep you off balance. Keep you focused on surviving the season instead of looking at the bigger picture. She was thinking fast, and Thomas could see it on her face. The way her eyes moved, the way she stood. If you're desperate enough by spring, you'll take whatever he offers for the land. And if I'm gone, if he could have gotten rid of me and the extra income I was bringing in, you'd be desperate sooner. The room was very quiet. Walt Greer stood by the door with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that said he had not fully understood, until this moment, what kind of woman had come to live at the Whitaker Ranch. Thomas was looking at Eleanor in a way he had not looked at her before. He underestimated you, Thomas said. Most people do, Eleanor said. He shouldn't have, Thomas said. I did, and I had less excuse than he does. Eleanor looked at him. There was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not apology. Closer to revelation. So what do we do? Walt said from the doorway. Thomas looked at Eleanor. It was the first time he had looked at her first before answering a question about his own ranch. And Eleanor, who had been waiting without knowing she was waiting, felt that look land somewhere deep and permanent. We find out what he knows, she said. And then we make sure we know more. We need to find out what he knows. Eleanor had said it plainly, the way she said most things that mattered. Without drama, without decoration. Just the clean shape of what needed to happen next. But knowing what needed to happen and making it happen were two different problems. And the distance between them was filled with everything they didn't know yet about Calvin Hargrove and the railroad men from Wichita, and whatever quiet machinery he had been running beneath the surface of normal business for the past year. Thomas spent 2 days thinking. He was not a man who moved fast when he didn't know the ground under his feet. That was the difference between him and men like Hargrove. Hargrove moved first and dealt with consequences later, and that worked for a man who had enough resources to absorb the cost of being wrong. Thomas had never had that luxury. He moved carefully, or he didn't move at all. But Eleanor did not move slowly. On the morning of the second day, while Thomas was still at his desk working through what he knew and didn't know, Eleanor put on her good wool coat, hitched the small wagon herself, and drove into Caldwell. She did not tell Thomas she was going. She told Walt. Walt, who had learned in the past several weeks that telling Thomas things Eleanor had asked him to keep quiet resulted in situations where nobody was comfortable, kept it quiet. Eleanor's first stop was the minister's wife, Margaret Hayward, who knew everything that happened in Caldwell, the way certain women in small towns always know everything. Not because they pry, but because people trust them, and trust makes people talkative. Margaret Hayward poured coffee without being asked, and sat down across from Eleanor and said, "I was wondering when you'd come." "You know something," Eleanor said. "I know several things," Margaret said. "What I don't know is what you want to do with them." "I want to protect my husband's land," Eleanor said. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Calvin Hargrove has been meeting with a man named Aldous Webb," she said. "Webb represents a land acquisition company out of Kansas City. They've been operating quietly through the western districts for about 8 months. buying up parcels ahead of what everyone expects will be the announcement of the Southern Spur Line extension. Who else knows about this? Eleanor said. The county clerk suspects, Margaret said. But the clerk is a careful man who does not speculate out loud. The mayor knows more than he says, which is not unusual for Mayor Finch. And... She paused. Hargrove has been making payments to at least one person in the county land office. We don't know who, but the records that should be public haven't been easy to access lately. Eleanor set her coffee cup down. He's controlling the information, she said. He's been very thorough, Margaret said. The men he's approached about selling, the ones who said no, they've all had problems afterward. Small problems, supply issues, permit delays. The kind of thing that's hard to prove is connected but adds up. Like a complaint about an unlicensed kitchen, Eleanor said. Exactly like that, Margaret said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, is there anything in writing? Any record of the land acquisition offers? If there is, it's with Hargrove, Margaret said. Or with Webb. Or with the men who said no, Eleanor said slowly. Margaret looked at her. Jeb Calloway, Eleanor said. The Pearson family. The McReady widow. She was already thinking forward, already building the shape of something. If each of them received a written offer, and Hargrove is a businessman, he would have made written offers, he'd want a paper trail he controlled. Then the offers exist, Margaret said. Then the offers exist, Eleanor said. And if we can collect enough of them and take them to the right person. The right person being someone outside Hargrove's reach, Margaret said, which in this county is a short list. What about the federal land office? Eleanor said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. There's a federal land agent, she said. Name of Harmon. He's based in Wichita, but he comes through this district quarterly. He's due in about 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Eleanor did the math in her head. 3 weeks was enough time to do what she was thinking, if she moved quickly, and if the people she needed to talk to were willing to talk. The question was whether they would be. She left Margaret's house and drove to the eastern edge of town, where Jeb Calloway had a small house he used when he was in Caldwell between supply runs. She found him in his front yard fixing a fence post, which was a thing men did in November when they were avoiding being indoors. Mrs. Whitaker, Calloway said. He looked surprised to see her, and then he looked like a man who was deciding whether surprise was the right response to being visited by a woman he'd only met twice. Mr. Calloway, Eleanor said, I need to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Calloway looked at the fence post, then at her. All right. When Hargrove offered to buy your land, Eleanor said, did he put it in writing? Calloway was still for a moment. Why? He said. Because I think he's done the same to at least 4 other ranchers in this district, Eleanor said. And I think if we can show a federal land agent what he's been doing, the pattern of it, the coordinated pressure, the connection to the railroad acquisition scheme, we can stop him before he gets enough land to make the spur line deal work on his terms. Calloway looked at her for a long time. Your husband know you're here? He said. My husband is thinking, Eleanor said. I'm acting. Something shifted on Calloway's face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the expression of a man who had just been surprised into respecting someone he hadn't thought about much before. He sent me a letter, Calloway said. Formal offer. My name on it, his name on it, the parcel described, the price, everything signed. Do you still have it? Eleanor said. I do, he said. Will you let me make a copy of it? Eleanor said. Calloway looked at his fence post. What exactly are you planning to do? He said. I'm going to build a case, Eleanor said. And when the federal land agent comes through in 3 weeks, I'm going to put that case in front of him in a way that Calvin Hargrove cannot dismiss, discredit, or buy his way out of. Calloway was quiet for another moment. You know what happens if this doesn't work, he said. Hargrove comes down harder. On all of us. I know, Eleanor said. And you're willing to do it anyway. I'm not willing to sit in my kitchen and wait for a man like Hargrove to decide how much my husband's land is worth, Eleanor said. So yes, I'm willing. Calloway went inside. He came back with a folded letter. Eleanor copied it at the kitchen table in his house while he stood by the door and watched, and when she was done, she handed back the original and tucked the copy carefully inside her coat. She visited the Pearson farm that same afternoon. Then the McReady widow, whose name was Clara, and who turned out to be a small, fierce woman in her 60s, who had been waiting, she said, for someone to do exactly what Eleanor was proposing. "I have 2 letters," Clara McReady said. "He sent a second one after I didn't answer the first." "May I copy both?" Eleanor said. "You may have the originals," Clara McReady said. "I've been wanting to put them somewhere useful since the day they arrived." Eleanor drove back to the ranch as the sun was going down, with 4 copied letters and 2 originals folded inside her coat, and a plan in her head that was still forming but had enough shape now to work with. Thomas was in the kitchen when she walked in. He looked at her. He looked at the way she moved, the particular set of her shoulders that he was learning to read, the steadiness in her face that meant she had been doing something. "Where were you?" he said. "Caldwell," she said. "Who did you see?" "Margaret Hayward, Jeb Calloway, the Pearson family, Clara McReady." She took the letters out of her coat and laid them on the kitchen table. Thomas came to the table. He looked at the letters. He picked up the top one. He read it. He set it down and picked up the next one. By the time he had read all 6, his jaw was tight in a way Eleanor had learned to recognize as the way Thomas held anger when he was not yet ready to spend it. "He sent written offers," Thomas said. "He's a businessman," Eleanor said. "He documents everything he thinks is in his favor. He probably didn't imagine anyone would put the documents together." "There's a federal land agent coming through in 3 weeks," Eleanor said. "A man named Harmon. He has jurisdiction over commercial land acquisition schemes that involve federal spur line routes." Thomas looked up at her. "How do you know that?" he said. "Margaret Hayward," Eleanor said. "And you think these letters are evidence of a coordinated acquisition scheme?" Eleanor said. "On their own, each one is just a business offer. Together, with the pattern of harassment and supply manipulation and permit interference, they're something else." Thomas was quiet. "We'd need to document the harassment too," he said. "The supply issues, the permit complaint, "I've already started," Eleanor said. She went to the shelf where her ledger lived and brought it to the table. She opened it to a section in the back she had started 3 days ago. A careful, dated account of every incident she could document. The complaint Hargrove had filed with the county board. The date and details of the supply rate increases. The 3 ranchers Walt had told them about who had experienced permit delays after refusing Hargrove's offers. Thomas looked at the ledger. He looked at Eleanor. "You started this 3 days ago," he said, "when Walt told us about the railroad." "Yes," she said. "You started building evidence before you even went into Caldwell today." "Yes," she said. Thomas put his hand flat on the ledger. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice had changed. Not softer exactly, but with less of the careful distance he usually kept between himself and the things he felt. "Why didn't you just tell me what you were doing?" Eleanor looked at him. "Because the last time I did something without telling you first," she said. "It was the kitchen sales. And you were angry." "I wasn't." He stopped. He exhaled. "I was startled. There's a difference." "Is there?" Eleanor said. Not unkindly, just honestly. Thomas was quiet. "I'm telling you now," Eleanor said. "All of it. Every step." "And if I'd said I didn't want you going into town alone asking questions about Hargrove?" Eleanor met his eyes. "Then I would have told you that this is my home too. That this land is my home too. And that I will not stand by and watch a man like Calvin Hargrove take it from us because I was waiting for permission to help." The kitchen was very still. Thomas looked at his wife. He had married a woman he thought would keep his house. He was beginning to understand that what he had actually done was invite a force of nature to share his table, and the only question now was whether he was man enough to stand beside her instead of in front of her. "All right," he said. Eleanor blinked. "All right?" "What do we do next?" he said. It was the we that did it. Eleanor had to look away for a moment. She composed herself with the same efficiency she brought to everything, and turned back to the table and the letters spread across it. "We need one more thing," she said. "We need someone inside Hargrove's operation. Someone who's seen what he's doing and might be willing to speak." Thomas thought about that. "His clerk," he said after a moment. "Young man named Terence Pratt. He's been working Hargrove's counter for about 2 years. He's been looking uncomfortable lately when I'm in the supply office." "Why uncomfortable?" Eleanor said. "The kind of uncomfortable a man gets when he knows something he wishes he didn't," Thomas said. Eleanor nodded slowly. "Is he local? Family here?" "Mother and a younger sister on a small place north of town," Thomas said. "Father died 3 years ago. Terence took the clerk job to support them." "Hargrove knows he can't afford to lose the job," Eleanor said. "That's likely why he hired him," Thomas said. They looked at each other. "He'll be scared," Eleanor said. "Yes," Thomas said. "But he's been carrying this for 2 years," Eleanor said. "That's a long time to know something wrong is happening and not be able to say so." Thomas reached for his hat. "I'll go in the morning," he said. "We'll go," Eleanor said. Thomas put his hat on. He looked at her for a moment. "We'll go," he agreed. Terence Pratt was 24 years old and had the look of someone who had been aging faster than his years should allow. He was thin and careful, and when Thomas and Eleanor walked into Hargrove's supply office the next morning, during the 15-minute window, when Hargrove himself was always at the bank, Terence went pale in a way that confirmed everything Thomas had suspected. "Mr. Whitaker," Terence said. He looked at Eleanor. "Ma'am, we need to talk," Thomas said. "Not about supplies." Terence looked at the door. "He'll be back in 10 minutes, Terence said. "Then we have 10 minutes, Eleanor said. She sat down in one of the chairs in front of the counter without being invited, which was, Thomas had noticed, what she always did when she wanted to make it clear that she intended to stay. "Terence, we know what Hargrove has been doing with the land purchases. We know about Aldous Webb and the Kansas City Acquisition Company. We know about the spur line." Terence had gone completely still. "We're going to the federal land agent in 3 weeks, Eleanor continued. "We have written evidence from 4 ranchers who received acquisition offers. We have a documented record of supply manipulation and permit interference." She paused. "What we don't have is someone who was inside it." Terence said nothing. "We are not asking you to do anything that puts your family at risk," Eleanor said. "We are asking whether there is anything you know that you think someone ought to know." The silence stretched. "He keeps books," Terence said. His voice was barely above a murmur. "Not the ones behind the counter, different ones. He keeps them in the back office in a locked drawer. I've seen them when he's taken them out. They have names, ranches, amounts." Thomas was very still. "The names of who he's paid off," he said. "I think so," Terence said. "I don't know for certain, but the amounts are large, larger than anything in the normal accounts." "The county land office," Eleanor said. "Someone there has been controlling access to public records." Terence looked at his hands on the counter. "His cousin works in the land office," he said. The room was quiet. Thomas reached into his coat and put a card on the counter. It had his name on it and the address of the ranch. "If you decide you want to tell someone what you know," he said, "you come to us first, before the agent comes. We'll make sure your name is protected as much as it can be." Terence looked at the card. He didn't pick it up, but he didn't move it away either. Thomas and Eleanor left. They walked to the wagon without speaking. Thomas helped Eleanor up, which was something he had not done the first week, but had started doing without comment somewhere in the past month. He climbed up beside her. He picked up the reins. Then he stopped. "His cousin," Thomas said. "In the land office," Eleanor said. "Which is why the records haven't been accessible." "Which means Hargrove has been running this longer and deeper than even Jeb Calloway knew," Thomas said. "Yes," Eleanor said. Thomas sat with that for a moment. "I had dinner with Calvin Hargrove twice last year," he said. "I sat across a table from him, and I thought he was a difficult man to do business with. I didn't think—" "Most people don't," Eleanor said. "That's how it works." Thomas shook his head slowly. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't looked at those supply numbers," he said. If you had just stayed in the kitchen, done what I asked. Eleanor was quiet. By spring, I would have been desperate enough to take whatever he offered, Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Eleanor said. Probably. And the land would be gone. Yes. Thomas looked at her. You knew, he said. When you showed me that ledger the first time, you knew it was bigger than just the supply overcharging. I suspected, Eleanor said. I didn't know about the railroad, but I knew that a man who would overcharge a struggling rancher for 18 months without blinking wasn't just greedy, he was strategic. Thomas exhaled. They were halfway back to the ranch when it happened. A rider came up fast from the south, and Thomas pulled the wagon to the side of the road on instinct, and the rider slowed when he recognized Thomas's face. It was Danny Croft. And Danny Croft, for once in his life, looked frightened. There's a man at the ranch, Danny said. Came about an hour after you left. Says he's from Hargrove. Says he needs to speak to Mr. Whitaker about a property matter. Danny paused. He looked at Eleanor. He said he'd wait. Thomas's jaw tightened. Did he say his name? Eleanor asked. Webb, Danny said. Aldous Webb. The name landed like a stone. Eleanor looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Eleanor. Between them passed the understanding that they had been planning to move carefully over 3 weeks, and Calvin Hargrove had just forced the timeline. How many men did he bring? Thomas said. 2, Danny said. They're waiting on the porch. Thomas took a breath. He looked at Eleanor. We go home, he said. Yes, Eleanor said. And whatever he says. We know more than he thinks we do, Eleanor said. Let him talk. Thomas urged the horse forward. The wagon moved. And the real confrontation, the one that would decide whether the Whitaker ranch stood or fell, was waiting for them at the end of their own road. Aldous Webb was not what Thomas had expected. He was not a large man. He was not loud or physically imposing in the way that certain businessmen from Kansas City tended to present themselves when they came into working ranch country, to remind people who had the money and who didn't. He was slight, well-dressed, with a precise quality to his movements that spoke of a man who had learned long ago that power did not require volume. He stood up from the porch step when Thomas's wagon came into the yard. Mr. Whitaker, he said. He touched the brim of his hat. He looked at Eleanor. Ma'am. Mr. Webb, Thomas said. He didn't offer his hand. You're a long way from Kansas City. Webb smiled. Business brings me out this way. I hope you'll forgive the unannounced visit. I tried to catch you in town, but I missed you. You didn't miss us, Eleanor said pleasantly. You came to the ranch because you wanted to speak to us here. Webb looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. A recalibration. Mrs. Whitaker, he said. I've heard about you. I imagine Hargrove's told you quite a bit, Eleanor said. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for assistance. Thomas was already on the ground and would have helped her, but she moved before he could, and stood facing Webb with her hands folded in front of her. Why don't you come inside and say what you came to say? Webb came inside. He sat at the kitchen table. Thomas's kitchen table. Eleanor's table. The table where all the real work of the Whitaker ranch had been done in the past 2 months. And he laid out the offer with the smooth efficiency of a man who had done this many times. It was a generous offer. That was the first thing Thomas noticed. More generous than anything Hargrove had led him to believe was possible. Enough to pay off every debt, settle in a smaller place, start over. Enough to make a desperate man say yes. Thomas was not desperate anymore. What's the timeline? Thomas said. We'd need the deed transfer completed within 60 days, Webb said. That's fast, Thomas said. The acquisition company works on a set schedule, Webb said. There are factors outside my control. Like a railroad announcement, Eleanor thought. Like a public declaration of the spur line route that will triple the value of this land the day it's announced and make this offer look like the robbery it is. I'll need to think about it, Thomas said. Webb nodded. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded document. The written offer, he said. All the terms are there. He slid it across the table. Thomas picked it up. Eleanor watched his face as he read it. Thomas read it twice. Then he set it on. Webb stood. He looked at Eleanor again, and this time the look was different. More careful, more assessing. As if he was trying to decide how much she knew. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I understand you've been a significant contributor to the operation here." "I have," Eleanor said. "Mr. Hargrove has mentioned you more than once," Webb said. "He seems to find you." He paused, choosing the word. "Impressive." "Does he?" Eleanor said. "He does," Webb said. "He also said to tell you that he admires your work. The kitchen operation, the preserves." Another pause. "He said to mention that a woman with your talent shouldn't limit herself to a failing ranch." The message inside the message was clear. Walk away. Take your husband with you. Make this easy, and maybe there's something in it for you. Eleanor smiled at Aldous Webb. It was a full smile this time. "You tell Mr. Hargrove," she said, "that I'm right where I belong." Webb left. Thomas and Eleanor stood at the kitchen table with the written offer between them, and Thomas picked it up and turned it over in his hands. "He put it all in writing," Thomas said. "The terms, his name, the company name." "Yes," Eleanor said. Thomas looked up at her. "That's 4 more pages of evidence," he said. Eleanor nodded. 3 weeks, she said. "We have 3 weeks until Harmon comes through." Thomas set the offer down. He put his hand on top of it. "Then we use every one of them," he said. And from the doorway, Walt Greer, who had apparently been standing there long enough to have heard all of it, said quietly, "Tell me what you need." Thomas looked at Walt. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Start with the letters," Eleanor said. "We're going to need them organized." Walt Greer was not a man who used many words, but he was a man who understood that some situations required moving fast and asking questions later. He had the letters organized on the kitchen table within 20 minutes. 6 original documents and 4 copies, arranged in chronological order by date of offer, with the names of the receiving ranchers written in Eleanor's hand on a separate sheet, alongside the documented dates of the subsequent harassment each had experienced. Thomas looked at the arrangement. "You did this already," he said to Eleanor. "I did the chronology last night," Eleanor said. "I couldn't sleep." Thomas looked at the table, at the letters, at his wife standing across from him with dark circles under her eyes, and a steadiness in her posture that belonged to someone who had slept badly and worked anyway. "You should have told me you couldn't sleep," he said. "You needed to," Eleanor said simply. Walt cleared his throat from the doorway, and then very deliberately found somewhere else to be. The 3 weeks before Agent Harmon's arrival became the most concentrated period of work the Whitaker Ranch had ever seen. And not all of it was the kind of work that showed up in daylight. Thomas rode out to the Pearson farm himself the day after Webb's visit. He had not had much occasion to speak with the Pearson family before. They were quiet people who kept to their land and their business. But Gerald Pearson opened the door before Thomas even knocked, as if he had been watching the road, and said, "I heard Hargrove sent someone out to your place." News traveled fast in this part of Kansas. "Webb," Thomas said. "You know him?" "Heard the name," Pearson said. "Come in." Gerald Pearson was in his 50s, built like a man who had spent 3 decades doing physical work without complaint. His wife, a woman named Ada, sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and looked at Thomas with the careful attention of someone who had learned to size people up quickly because their family's situation did not allow for the luxury of being wrong. "We need to present a coordinated case to the federal land agent," Thomas said. He didn't ease into it. He had learned in the past several weeks that Eleanor was right about plain speaking. People responded to it better than they responded to circumnavigation. Not just individual complaints, a pattern, documented, with names attached. "That's a risk," Pearson said. "I know," Thomas said. "If this doesn't work..." "It'll work," Thomas said. Pearson looked at him. "You sound sure of that," Pearson said. "My wife put together the case," Thomas said. "I'm sure of her." Ada Pearson looked at her husband. Something passed between them. the particular communication of two people who have lived together long enough to have whole conversations without words. "We'll sign whatever you need," Ada said. Gerald looked at his wife, then back at Thomas. "What she said," he told him. Thomas rode back to the ranch with the Pearson signatures and the particular feeling of a man who keeps discovering he has more allies than he thought, which was not a feeling he was accustomed to, and which sat strangely alongside the fear that kept rising in his chest whenever he thought about what happened if they were wrong about Harmon, or wrong about Webb's timeline, or wrong about any one of the dozen things that had to go right. Eleanor was in the kitchen when he got back. She looked up when he came through the door and read his face before he said a word. "They signed," she said. "They signed," he said. She nodded and turned back to the stove. "Clara McReady sent a letter this afternoon," she said. "She found a third document. Hargrove sent a third offer after she ignored the second. She said it came with what she described as a warning." Thomas stopped. "A warning. Written diplomatically," Eleanor said. "But a warning. Something about how the land market was going to shift in ways that might leave her unable to find a buyer if she waited too long." "He told her the land value was going to change," Thomas said, "before any public announcement." "He assumed she wouldn't understand what that meant," Eleanor said. "Does she?" "Clara McReady understood exactly what it meant," Eleanor said. "She kept all 3 letters specifically because she understood." Thomas sat down at the kitchen table. It was becoming his habit, sitting at this table. He had spent 7 years at his desk in the office, keeping the house at a distance, keeping his household at a distance, keeping himself at a manageable distance from everything that wasn't cattle and land. And somehow, in the past 2 months, the kitchen table had become the place where everything real happened. He thought about that. I thought about what it meant that his wife had known, before he did, that this table was where things got decided. "Eleanor," he said. She was stirring something on the stove. "When you agreed to marry me," he said, "knowing what I told you, that I needed someone to keep the house and nothing more, why did you agree?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She did not stop stirring. "Because I could see the ranch," she said finally. "I could see what it needed. And I could see," she paused, "I could see what you needed, even if you couldn't." "What did I need?" Thomas asked. Eleanor turned around and looked at him. "Someone who wasn't afraid of you," she said. Thomas sat with that. "Most people are," he said. "Most people are careful around you," Eleanor said. "There's a difference. You're not a cruel man, but you're a certain man, and certain men can be hard to talk to." She turned back to the stove. "I was never afraid of you. I was just waiting for you to stop being afraid of me." Thomas said nothing. Because there was nothing to say to that, except yes. And he wasn't ready to say yes out loud yet. The 10th day after Webb's visit, it was when things began to move faster than anyone had planned. Terrence Pratt rode out to the ranch in the early afternoon on a horse that suggested he had borrowed it in a hurry, and when Danny Croft brought him to the kitchen door, his face had the look of a man who had made a decision and was moving before he could change his mind. Eleanor opened the door. "Terrence," she said. "Ma'am," he said. "I need to speak to Mr. Whitaker." "You can speak to both of us," she said. She stepped back from the door. Terrence came in. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in both hands and looked at Thomas, who had come from the office at the sound of the horse. "He knows," Terrence said. Thomas was still. "Hargrove?" "He knows you've been talking to the other ranchers," Terrence said. "He doesn't know exactly what you have, but he knows you've been collecting something." Webb told him about the visit here. Hargrove. He started pulling the other account books, the ones I told you about. He moved them. "Moved them where?" Thomas said. "I don't know," Terrence said. "He sent me out of the office for an errand, and when I came back the drawer was empty." Eleanor looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Eleanor. "He's covering his tracks," Eleanor said. "How much time do we have before Harmon arrives?" Thomas said. 11 days, Eleanor said. "If Hargrove moves those books out of Caldwell," Thomas started. "Then we lose the internal evidence," Eleanor said. "What we have from the ranchers is strong, but it's the books that connect the payments to the county land office. She turned back to Terence. Did you ever see what was inside them? Names, amounts, dates? Terence twisted his hat in his hands. I saw one page, he said. About 4 months ago. He left it open on the desk, and when he realized I'd walked in, he closed it. But I saw... He stopped. There were 2 columns, names and numbers. The names I recognized. 2 of them were men who work in the county offices. Could you write down what you saw? Eleanor said. From memory, Terence said. It won't hold up like the actual books. No, Eleanor said. But it points Harmon in the right direction. She pulled the ledger from the shelf. Her ledger, the one that had started all of this, and opened it to a fresh page. She put it on the table in front of Terence with a pen beside it. Write down everything you remember, exactly as you saw it. Don't try to interpret it, just what you saw. Terence sat down. He wrote for 20 minutes. Thomas read over his shoulder without speaking. When Terence was done, Eleanor took the ledger and read what he had written. Then she read it again. There's a number here, she said. She pointed to a figure Terence had written. This amount. This matches almost exactly the discrepancy I found in the county land office access records that Margaret Hayward told me about. Thomas looked at the number. The payment to Hargrove's cousin, he said. If it's the same amount, Eleanor said. It's not proof, Thomas said. No, Eleanor said. But it's enough for Harmon to subpoena the actual records. She looked at Terence. Thank you for coming. Terence stood. He looked like a man who had put down something heavy he'd been carrying for a long time and wasn't entirely sure how to walk without the weight of it. What happens now? He said. To me. If we do this right, Thomas said, what happens is that Hargrove loses the ability to pressure anyone in this district, including you. He paused. Your job may not be there afterward. I know, Terence said. The ranch can use another hand, Thomas said, if you find yourself needing work. Terence looked at him for a long moment. I'll think on that, he said. He left. Thomas stood in the kitchen after the door closed and was quiet for a long moment. We're close, he said. We're close, Eleanor agreed. But he's going to move before Harmon gets here. We have to assume that. What does he do? Thomas said. If he knows we've been gathering evidence. He tries to discredit us before we can present it, Eleanor said. He'll go to the county board. He'll use whatever relationships he has there to make us look like disgruntled business complainants rather than witnesses to a coordinated fraud. He's already started, Thomas said slowly. The kitchen complaint, the supply contract dispute. He paused. To someone who doesn't know the whole story, it looks like we have a grudge against him. Yes, Eleanor said. So we need to get to Harmon before Hargrove gets to Harmon, Thomas said. Eleanor looked at him. Can you find out exactly when and where Harmon enters the district? She said. I can ask the sheriff, Thomas said. Harmon usually checks in with local law enforcement first. Then find out, Eleanor said. And we meet him at the edge of the district if we have to. Thomas reached for his hat. He was at the door when Eleanor said, Thomas. He turned. Be careful how you ask, she said. The sheriff is a cautious man. If Hargrove has already been in his ear. He has, Thomas said. Hargrove is in everyone's ear. He settled his hat. But the sheriff is also a man who cares about his land. His family has a farm north of town. He's not on Hargrove's list because he's not desperate enough. He paused. Yet. Tell him that, Eleanor said. Tell him yet. Thomas rode into Caldwell. He found Sheriff Alderman at his office, and he told him plainly, not everything, but enough. The land acquisition scheme, the railroad connection, the pattern of pressure on struggling ranchers. He watched Alderman's face as he talked, and saw the particular stillness that came over a man when he was hearing something he had been half suspecting and suddenly had the shape of it. I've been noticing things, Alderman said. The permit delays, the McReady situation. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't have enough to act on. We do now, Thomas said. But we need to know when Harmon comes through. Alderman looked at him for a long moment. He arrives Friday, Alderman said. He usually stops at the hotel on the north end of town and reviews local matters Saturday morning before making his rounds. Friday was 9 days away. If I were to arrange a meeting at the hotel Saturday morning, Thomas said, between Harmon and several landholders with documented evidence of a coordinated acquisition fraud. I'd say that sounded like a legitimate use of his time, Alderman said carefully. Would you be there? Thomas said. Alderman put his hands flat on his desk. I'd be there, he said. Thomas rode home. Eleanor was at the kitchen table with Clara McReady when he walked in, which startled him. He had not known Eleanor had invited anyone, and Clara McReady looked up at him with the fierce sharpness that was apparently just her natural expression, and said, Your wife is the most organized person I have met in 40 years of living in this district. I thought you should know that. Thomas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back at him with a calm that contained, he was almost certain, a suppressed satisfaction. Saturday morning, Thomas told her. Harmon, Sheriff will be there. Clara McReady hit the kitchen table with her palm. Good, she said. The 9 days that followed had a particular quality of suspended tension. The feeling of a rope pulled tight between 2 points. Everything still. Everything waiting for one side to give. Thomas kept the ranch running. The cattle needed feeding regardless of what Calvin Hargrove was planning in his back office. The storage shed that Eleanor had proposed was half built by 2 of the ranch hands who had appointed themselves to the project without being asked, which Thomas noticed and said nothing about, except to make sure they had enough lumber. Eleanor baked. Not because she was ignoring what was coming. Because she was the kind of woman who kept her hands useful when her mind was working hardest. The bread orders for the Caldwell Hotel had been running for 3 weeks now, and she had taken on a second customer, a boarding house on the south side of town, whose proprietress had tracked Eleanor down after hearing about the hotel arrangement, and had offered a rate that Eleanor had negotiated up by 15% before agreeing. Thomas found out about the second customer, the same way he found out about most of Eleanor's business developments. When the evidence was already established, and she mentioned it the way she mentioned things she considered self-evident. You negotiated them up, Thomas said. They were lowballing, Eleanor said. They expected me to be grateful for any offer. Thomas was quiet for a moment. 15%, he said. 17, actually, Eleanor said. I told you 15 because that's what I expected to get, and 17 is what I actually got. Thomas leaned against the kitchen door frame. Why did you tell me 15 if you got 17? He said. Eleanor looked at him. Because I was testing whether you'd be proud of 15, she said. If you were, I was going to tell you it was 17. And if I hadn't been? Thomas said. Eleanor's chin came up slightly. Then we would have had a conversation, she said. Thomas stood there looking at his wife. Then he said, I'm proud of 17. Eleanor's expression moved in a way he was learning to recognize. Not quite a smile, but the thing that lived in the same place a smile would. I know, she said. 4 days before Harmon's arrival, Hargrove moved. Not carefully. Not the way he had been moving until now. Calculated, patient, operating through intermediaries and paper trails that kept his hands clean. He moved the way a man moves when he is running out of time, and has started to understand that the situation has changed in ways he hadn't accounted for. He came to the ranch himself. Walt Greer saw him coming up the road and came to the kitchen door and said quietly to Eleanor, Hargrove. Alone. No Webb. Eleanor put down her rolling pin. Where's Thomas? She said. North pasture, Walt said. Eleanor untied her apron. Go get him, she said. Don't run. Walk. I don't want Hargrove to think we're alarmed. Walt went. Eleanor went to the front door and opened it before Hargrove reached the porch. Calvin Hargrove was a man who had spent his life being the most comfortable person in any room he entered. He had a quality of settled authority that came from decades of being the one who set the terms, of transactions, of relationships, of the general understanding between himself and the world. He stepped up onto the Whitaker porch and looked at Eleanor with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man who has decided that the woman in front of him is the obstacle and has come to clear it. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, is your husband available? He'll be here shortly, Eleanor said. You're welcome to wait. She did not invite him inside. That was a choice, and he noticed it. He stood on the porch and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched longer than comfort allowed. I'll be direct, Hargrove said finally. Please, Eleanor said. You've been building something, he said. You and Thomas. I know what it looks like. I've seen people try to make complaints to federal agents before. He paused. It rarely goes the way they think it will. Rarely, Eleanor said. But not never. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, and his voice shifted. Lower, more deliberate, the voice of a man who is offering something he expects to be understood. I don't have a quarrel with you personally. I never did. My difficulty was always with certain aspects of the ranch's operation, changes that affected my own business. Changes I caused, Eleanor said. Changes that created friction, Hargrove said. I renegotiated an unfair contract, Eleanor said. The friction was the contract being fair. Hargrove looked at her. I came to make a better offer, he said. For the land. Terms that are more favorable. I can go significantly above what Webb presented. The land isn't for sale, Eleanor said. Speak to your husband first, Hargrove said. My husband will tell you the same thing, Eleanor said. Will he? Hargrove said. And something in the way he said it made Eleanor go still. Not afraid. Still. The way she went still when she was reading a situation and deciding what it meant. Thomas has been running a struggling operation for a long time, Mrs. Whitaker. I know this land. I know what a bad spring looks like for a rancher in debt. I know what options start to look reasonable when a man is tired and the cattle market doesn't recover. You're threatening him, Eleanor said. I'm being realistic, Hargrove said. No, Eleanor said. You're describing a situation you intend to create. You're telling me that if we don't sell, you'll make sure the spring is bad enough that we wish we had. She held his gaze. That's a threat, and it's the most honest thing you've said to me. Hargrove was quiet. Behind him, she heard Thomas's boots on the porch steps. Thomas came up beside Eleanor. He had been walking fast from the north pasture, she could tell from his breathing. But he had it controlled by the time he reached them, and his face gave nothing away. Calvin, he said. Thomas, Hargrove said. He looked at Eleanor, and then back at Thomas. I was explaining to your wife that I've come with an improved offer. She told you no, Thomas said. I'd like you to hear the terms. Calvin, Thomas said. His voice was level, not angry, not warm. The voice of a man who has decided where he stands and doesn't need to raise it to make that clear. This ranch is not for sale. Not at the price you offered through Webb. Not at a higher price. Not in the spring when you've done whatever you're planning to do to make us desperate. We are not selling. Hargrove looked between them. You're making a mistake, he said. We've made some, Thomas said. This isn't one of them. Hargrove left. Thomas and Eleanor stood on the porch and watched his horse disappear down the road. He's going to come after the business, Eleanor said. The kitchen license, the hotel contract. He'll pressure the hotel not to take the order. Yes, Thomas said. We have 4 days, Eleanor said. I know, Thomas said. They stood together on that porch, the wind coming across the range cold and direct, neither of them speaking, and Thomas reached over without looking at her and took her hand. Eleanor went still. Not afraid. Not surprised exactly. Still, the way she went still when something was happening that she needed to feel completely. His hand was large and rough calloused, and it held hers with a firmness that wasn't gentle, but wasn't rough either. It was the grip of a man who had decided he was holding something he was not going to let go of. She held on back. They stood there for another moment. Then Eleanor said, I need to send word to Clara McReady. I'll have Danny ride out, Thomas said. Tell Walt to keep watch on the road tonight, Eleanor said. Already thinking it, Thomas said. He let go of her hand. They went back inside. The hotel manager, a cautious man named Briggs, received a visit from one of Hargrove's business associates the following morning. The associate made various suggestions about the wisdom of local businesses maintaining certain supply relationships. He implied, without stating directly, that the hotel's future license renewals might be complicated by association with certain ranch operations that were under review. Briggs, to his credit, came to Eleanor directly that afternoon and told her exactly what had been said. Eleanor thanked him. Then she asked him one question. "Mr. Briggs, do you want to keep taking my bread orders?" Briggs looked at her. "Your bread has increased our breakfast service by 30% in 3 weeks," he said. "Do you understand what that means?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "It means the bread stays." "The bread stays," Briggs said. He left. Eleanor told Thomas that evening. 30%, Thomas said. "He didn't tell me that to impress me," Eleanor said. "He told me because he wanted me to understand that he had a reason to stand firm." Thomas looked at her. "You knew he'd tell you," Thomas said. "I thought he might," Eleanor said. "Because you knew the bread was doing that well, and you knew he'd lead with it," Thomas said. "I counted on him being a businessman," Eleanor said. "Businessmen make decisions based on numbers. The number was 30%. Thomas shook his head slowly. "You think 3 moves ahead," he said. "Not a complaint, not entirely wonder, something between them." "Sometimes 4, Eleanor said. 2 days before Harmon arrived, Terence Pratt came back. He came at night this time, which meant he had waited for Hargrove to be away from the office, and when Eleanor opened the door, he was pale and shaking slightly, with something that looked like a combination of cold and adrenaline. "I found something," he said. Thomas was there in 30 seconds. Terence reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "He moved the books," Terence said. "But he didn't move everything. There was a page, loose. It must have fallen out when he was taking the books. It was behind the drawer, stuck to the back panel. I only found it because I was cleaning." Thomas took the paper. He unfolded it. Eleanor came to stand beside him, and they read it together in the lamplight of the kitchen. It was a single page from the account books. 2 columns. Names and amounts. 7 names total. 2 of them they recognized immediately from Terence's earlier testimony. 3 more were names Eleanor had seen in the public land records. County officials. And at the bottom of the page, one entry set slightly apart from the others. A name. An amount. And beside it, a notation in Hargrove's handwriting that read, "Railroad Com. Confirmed." "Railroad Commission," Thomas said quietly. Eleanor looked at him. "He has someone in the Railroad Commission," she said. "That's how he knew the route before it was announced. That's how he's been ahead of it for a year." The kitchen was very quiet. "This is it," Thomas said. "This is it," Eleanor said. Terence was watching them both. "Is it enough?" he said. Thomas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the page. "Combined with the rancher's letters," she said. "Combined with the timeline of harassment. Combined with Webb's written offer and what you saw in the books." She looked up. "Yes, it's enough." Terence let out a long breath. "I want to be there," he said. "When you show Harmon, I want to be a witness." Thomas looked at him. "You understand what that means," Thomas said. "Hargrove will know." "I know," Terence said. "I've known what he was doing for 2 years. I've been too afraid to say so." He looked at his hands. "I'm done being afraid." Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Thomas and Eleanor rode into Caldwell together. Behind them came Walt Greer, Clara McReady, Gerald and Ada Pearson, Jeb Calloway, and Terence Pratt. Sheriff Alderman met them at the edge of town and rode with them the rest of the way. At the hotel, Agent Harmon was a quiet, thorough man in his 40s, who had the manner of someone who had heard many stories in many towns, and had learned to listen to all of them with equal patience and reserved judgment until he had seen the documents. He saw the documents. He took his time. Eleanor had organized everything. The way she organized everything. Chronologically, cross-referenced, with a summary page at the front that laid out the pattern in plain language anyone could follow. She had not done it for drama. She had done it because a clear thing is harder to dismiss than a complicated one. Harmon read the summary page. Then he read the letters. Then he read the Terence page. He put it down on the hotel table and was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "did you compile this?" I did, Eleanor said. How long did this take you? About 3 weeks, Eleanor said. Harmon looked at the stack of documents, then at Eleanor. You understand what this represents. A coordinated federal land acquisition fraud with a connection to the Railroad Commission, Eleanor said. Yes. Harmon looked at Thomas. Your wife, he said. Yes, Thomas said. She put all of this together. She put all of this together, Thomas said. Harmon nodded slowly. He picked up the documents again. Mr. Whitaker, he said, I'm going to need a formal statement from everyone in this room. And I'm going to need you and your wife available for the next several days. He looked at Eleanor. Can you walk me through the chronology? Yes, Eleanor said. She sat down across from the federal land agent. She opened her ledger, and for the next 2 hours, Eleanor Brooks Whitaker did exactly what she had been doing since the day she set a leather-bound book on Thomas Whitaker's desk and showed him what he had been missing. She laid out the truth, clearly, completely, and without apology. Agent Harmon did not move slowly. That was the first thing Thomas noticed about the man. That beneath the quiet patience and the careful listening was a machinery that, once set in motion, moved with the kind of deliberate speed that told you it had done this before and knew exactly where each step led. By Sunday morning, less than 24 hours after Eleanor had walked him through the chronology in the hotel meeting room, Harmon had sent 2 wires, one to his office in Wichita, one to the Federal Land Commission in Kansas City, and had requested access to the county land office records under federal authority, which superseded anything Hargrove's cousin could do to slow it down. The cousin, a man named Peters, who had apparently been comfortable in his position for long enough to have forgotten what accountability felt like, found out about the federal access request at 9 in the morning, and by 10 o'clock had sent word to Hargrove. Hargrove, according to Walt Greer, who had ears in Caldwell, the way certain men have roots in ground they've worked for decades, spent approximately 40 minutes in his office alone before emerging and riding to see his lawyer. He's scared, Walt told Thomas. Good, Thomas said. Scared men do stupid things, Walt said. Thomas looked at him. What kind of stupid things? Don't know yet, Walt said. But I'd keep an eye on the road. Thomas kept an eye on the road. Eleanor kept working. Not because she was calm. She wasn't entirely calm, and she would not have claimed to be. She was the kind of woman who processed anxiety through motion, through usefulness, through the application of her hands to something concrete, while her mind worked over the variables she couldn't control. So she baked. She did the hotel order. She answered the 3 new inquiries that had come in from households in Caldwell who had heard about the preserves through the boarding house proprietress, and she wrote careful responses to each one, and quoted her rates, and felt, underneath the fear that lived in her chest like a held breath, a particular satisfaction at the solidity of what she had built. It was hers. Not Thomas's kitchen that she happened to work in. Her business. Her ledger. Her customers. Her grandmother's recipe, multiplied now across an operation that 3 months ago had been nothing but an idea she hadn't yet told anyone. She thought about her grandmother sometimes, in those early mornings before the ranch woke up, thought about what the woman would have made of all this. The fight, the documents, the federal agent, the husband who had started as a wall and was becoming something else entirely. Her grandmother had been a woman who built things in difficult conditions and never once asked for permission to do it. She had simply done it and let the doing speak for itself. Eleanor was doing the same. She just had better documentation. Monday brought the first real news. Harmon came to the ranch himself, which Eleanor had not expected. She had thought communication would go through Sheriff Alderman, through the formal channels that federal processes preferred. Instead, Harmon knocked on the kitchen door at 10:30 in the morning and accepted the coffee Eleanor offered him and sat at the kitchen table with the directness of a man who had decided that the most useful place to be was where the information had originated. The county land office records confirm the pattern, he said. The access restrictions, the delayed filings, they match the timeline of your documentation exactly. Peters has been questioned. He paused. He was cooperative. He talked, Eleanor said. People in his position usually do, Harmon said, when they understand what not talking costs them. What did he say? Thomas said. Enough, Harmon said. Hargrove was routing payments through a secondary account operated by the land acquisition company, Webb's company. The payments to Peters, to 2 other county officials, and— he looked at the table for a moment. To a junior clerk at the Railroad Commission office in Topeka. Thomas exhaled. So the railroad connection is confirmed, Eleanor said. It is, Harmon said. The commission clerk had access to the preliminary route surveys. He passed the information to Webb, who passed it to Hargrove, who began acquiring land approximately 11 months ago based on that information. He looked at Eleanor. Your timeline document showed the first Hargrove land approach to a district rancher as 11 months and 3 weeks ago. Eleanor was quiet. 3 weeks for him to put the acquisition plan together after getting the information, she said. That's our estimate, Harmon said. How many parcels has he already acquired? Thomas said. 7 completed purchases in this district, Harmon said. 3 more with signed agreements that haven't closed yet. Those 3 will be frozen pending the investigation. 7 parcels. Thomas thought about that. 7 families who had sold their land to a man who had made sure they were desperate enough to do it. 7 pieces of Kansas ground that had passed out of the hands of people who had worked it because Calvin Hargrove had known something they didn't and had used that knowledge like a weapon. Can the completed sales be unwound? Thomas asked. Harmon was quiet for a moment. That's a more complicated question, he said. In some cases, possibly. If we can demonstrate that the sellers were operating under conditions of manufactured duress, supply manipulation, permit interference, there may be grounds. It will take time, and it won't be simple. But it's possible, Eleanor said. It's possible, Harmon said. He finished his coffee. He looked at Eleanor across the table. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, I want to be direct with you about something. Please, she said. In 15 years of federal land work, Harmon said, I have received exactly 3 complaints that arrived organized, cross-referenced, and sufficiently documented to move immediately to a formal investigation without requiring weeks of preliminary evidence gathering. He paused. This is the 4th. He looked at the ledger sitting on the shelf. Her ledger, the slim leather-bound book that had started as a household accounting tool and had become the spine of a federal fraud case. Whoever taught you to document a situation like this did you an extraordinary service. No one taught me, Eleanor said. I ran my mother's boarding house for 6 years. You learn to keep records when the money is tight enough that a single missed entry can cost you a week's worth of food. Harmon nodded slowly. Well, he said, this district owes you something it probably doesn't know how to say yet. He stood. He shook Thomas's hand. He touched the brim of his hat to Eleanor. He left. Thomas and Eleanor sat at the table after Harmon's wagon had gone. 7 families, Thomas said. I know, Eleanor said. If we'd sold— We didn't, Eleanor said. If you hadn't looked at those supply numbers— He stopped. Eleanor looked at him. Thomas, she said. I keep thinking about it, he said. About how close it was. About what would have happened if I'd said no when you tried to show me the ledger. If I'd— He exhaled. I almost did. You know that. I was about to tell you to stay in your part of the house and let me handle my business. I know, Eleanor said. Why didn't you give up? He said. When I pushed back. When I said you were overstepping. You had every reason to just— Because I could see what was happening, Eleanor said. And because giving up on something that matters because someone tells you to is something I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to do. Thomas was quiet. Someone told you that before, he said. To give up. To stay in your place. Eleanor met his eyes. Many people, she said. My whole life. Thomas looked at his wife, really looked at her, the way he had been learning to look at her in the past months, not assessing what she could do for him, but seeing who she was, the full weight of it. I was one of them, he said. In the beginning, Eleanor said. Yes. I'm sorry for that, he said. It was not the first time he had moved toward an apology, but it was the first time he said it that directly, without qualifying it, without the careful distance he usually kept between himself and the things he felt. Eleanor received it. She didn't minimize it. The way women were expected to minimize the acknowledgments they finally received after working too long without them. She just said, "I know you are," and let it stand. Calvin Hargrove was formally served with federal papers on Wednesday morning. The news reached the Whitaker Ranch through Clara McReady, who had apparently been in Caldwell specifically to watch it happen, and rode out to the ranch afterward with a satisfaction on her face that Eleanor thought was one of the most beautiful things she had seen in a long time. "He turned white as flour," Clara said, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a coffee cup. "His lawyer was right there, and he still went white." "Was Webb there?" Eleanor asked. "Webb left Monday," Clara said. "Gone back to Kansas City. But from what Harmon told Alderman, Webb isn't going anywhere that federal authority can't follow." She looked at Thomas. "Aldous Webb's acquisition company is going to be investigated alongside Hargrove, the whole operation." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "The Railroad Commission clerk," he said. "Suspended pending investigation," Clara said. "Which means the route announcement is delayed until the commission can verify nothing about the final decision was compromised." She looked at Eleanor. "Your ledger is being entered as primary evidence." Eleanor blinked. "My ledger," she said. Harmon told Alderman it was the clearest single document he'd seen in a federal land case in a decade, Clara said. He used the word meticulous. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Then Danny Croft, who had apparently been standing in the doorway long enough to have heard most of this, said, "Ma'am?" Eleanor looked at him. Danny Croft had, over the past 3 months, undergone a transformation that Thomas privately considered one of the more remarkable things he had witnessed on his own property. The boy who had made a cruel joke about Eleanor's size on her first morning at the ranch was gone. Not dramatically, not through any single moment of reckoning, but gradually, the way a man changes when he is in the daily presence of someone who is consistently more capable and more decent than he expected. He had started opening doors. He had started saying ma'am without being reminded. He had, 3 weeks ago, spent an entire Saturday helping Eleanor's hired kitchen helper carry supply deliveries without being asked and without saying a word about it to anyone. "Yes, Danny," Eleanor said. "I just wanted to say," Danny said, and he was clearly uncomfortable and clearly committed to getting through it anyway, "that I'm sorry for what I said the first morning. It wasn't right. And I knew it wasn't right when I said it." Eleanor looked at him. "Thank you, Danny," she said. "I should have said it sooner," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "But you said it." Danny nodded. His ears went red. He went back to wherever he had come from. Clara McReady watched him go. "How do you do that?" Clara asked. "Do what?" Eleanor said. "Make people want to be better," Clara said, "without making them feel small for having been worse." Eleanor considered the question seriously, the way she considered most questions. "I don't know that I do anything," she said. "I think people mostly want to do better. They just need someone around who expects it of them." She looked at her coffee cup. "And someone who doesn't give them the satisfaction of making them feel forgiven too quickly." Clara laughed. A real laugh, the kind that belonged to a woman who did not laugh easily. Thomas, from his chair at the table, watched his wife accept a compliment with the same steadiness she brought to everything else, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for longer than he had known. The formal investigation moved through December and into the new year. Hargrove's supply operation was suspended pending audit. His commercial licenses were frozen. The county officials who had taken payments, Peters and 2 others, were removed from their positions. The Railroad Commission clerk's information was referred to federal prosecutors in Topeka. Hargrove himself did not flee, which Thomas had half expected. He stayed in Caldwell, and he lawyered up, and he became very quiet in the way that men become quiet when they are listening to the sound of everything they built, collapsing around them, and have not yet found the angle from which it can be salvaged. Terrence Pratt's testimony was entered into the record. He had come forward formally in the first week of the investigation, sitting across from Harmon and a federal recorder, and saying plainly what he had seen over 2 years in Hargrove's employ. He had lost his job, which he had known he would. He had moved back to his mother's house north of town, which he had also known he would. He showed up at the Whitaker Ranch on a Tuesday morning in January and said he was ready to take Thomas up on the offer. Thomas put him to work that same day. Walt Greer, who managed the new arrangement with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, told Eleanor later that evening that Terence Pratt was the hardest-working young man he had seen come through the Whitaker gate, which from Walt was approximately equivalent to a speech of commendation. Eleanor told Thomas. Thomas said, "Good." Eleanor said, "You knew he would be." Thomas said, "I hoped." The distinction mattered, and they both knew it. Thomas was learning the difference between knowing and hoping. Learning that some things required you to move without certainty, to extend trust before it was proven, to act on the belief that people were capable of what you needed them to be. It did not come naturally to him. He was a man built on certainty, on what could be seen and measured and held. But Eleanor had been showing him, one situation at a time, that the things you couldn't measure were sometimes the ones that held everything else together. The Whitaker Ranch kitchen operation received its formal commercial expansion approval in February. Eleanor hired 2 women part-time, one from a family east of Caldwell that had been struggling since their patriarch's injury the previous harvest. One, a young widow in town, who had been taking in laundry and looking for something steadier. She paid them fair wages, which in 1887, Kansas was not a complicated calculation, but required a deliberate choice that not everyone would have made. She trained them in her grandmother's methods, with the particular patience of someone who understands that the way you teach a thing shapes the way it gets done for years afterward. The hotel order doubled. The boarding house added a weekly preserved goods order. A mercantile in a town 12 miles east sent a letter of inquiry. Eleanor answered the letter herself. Thomas found her at the kitchen table one evening writing the response, and he stood in the doorway watching her for a moment. Her pen moving across the page, the lamplight on her face, the particular focused stillness she got when she was working. And something moved through him that he had not expected to feel in his own kitchen, in his own house, at this stage of his life. Something that took him a moment to identify, because it wasn't gratitude exactly, though gratitude was in it. And it wasn't respect, though he felt that too more solidly than he had felt it for any person in recent memory. It was something older and quieter and more fundamental than either of those things. It was the feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He had not felt that in 17 years of running this ranch. He had felt capable, occasionally. He had felt competent. He had felt the particular satisfaction of hard work completed and survival maintained. But he had not felt that he was where he was supposed to be, that the life he was living was the one that fit the actual shape of him. He hadn't known that was missing until Eleanor put her ledger on his desk. He stepped into the kitchen. Eleanor looked up. "You're staring," she said. "I am," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Everything all right?" she said. "Yes," he said. He sat down across from her at the table. "I want to ask you something." Eleanor set her pen down. "When we married," Thomas said, "I told you what I needed. I said I needed someone to keep the house. I gave you a list of duties." He paused. "I want to ask you something I didn't ask then. I want to ask it properly." Eleanor was very still. "Eleanor," Thomas said. He looked at her with the directness he brought to everything important, the plainness that was the truest thing about him when he let it be. "Do you want to stay?" The question landed between them. Not stay as an obligation. Not stay because she had agreed to and the agreement held. Stay as a choice. Stay because the life being built in this house was a life she chose, actively, with her eyes open. Eleanor held the question the way she held all things that mattered, carefully, without rushing. "I have a business here," she said. "You could take that business somewhere else," Thomas said, "if you wanted to." "I have women I'm employing," she said. "You could employ them somewhere else," Thomas said. He was not going to make this easy for himself by letting her dodge it. "Eleanor, do you want to stay here, with me?" Eleanor looked at him. "You're not the man I thought I was marrying," she said. Thomas held her gaze. "No." "You were harder than I expected," she said, "and more afraid than you knew, and more stubborn than anyone should reasonably be about asking for help. "Yes," he said. "And you're also—" She stopped. She looked at her hands on the table for a moment. "You're a man who rode to the county seat and put my name first on a commercial license, who told a federal agent I built that case and didn't hesitate, who sat at a kitchen table and listened when a woman he'd married for practical reasons started talking about her grandmother's bread." She looked up at him. "You are not the man I married. You are a better one." Thomas was quiet. "So yes," Eleanor said, "I want to stay." Thomas reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, the way he had put it over her hand on the porch. Firm, certain, the grip of a man who has decided. And Eleanor turned her hand over and held his back, the way she had on the porch. And this time, neither of them let go for a long time. Spring arrived with the particular stubbornness of Kansas spring. Reluctant, then sudden, then overwhelming. As if the land had been holding everything back, and finally decided it had waited long enough. The cattle had come through the winter in better condition than any winter in the past 4 years, which the ranch hands attributed to several factors, including the improved feed storage and the supplemental winter supply arrangements Eleanor had negotiated in October. Walt Greer, presenting Thomas with the spring count, said simply, "Best outcome I've seen since your father's time." And Thomas received that information with a steadiness that contained, Eleanor thought, a grief and a pride wound so closely together it was impossible to separate them. The storage shed was finished in March. Thomas had it built a third larger than Eleanor's original specification, because by the time construction started, the expanded kitchen operation had made the original dimensions inadequate. Eleanor had said nothing about this decision, which was to say, she had looked at the larger dimensions and looked at Thomas and communicated an entire sentence without words. Thomas had communicated back, in the same wordless language they were building together. Something like, "Yes, I know, I was wrong about the size, let it go." Eleanor let it go. But she noted it in her ledger. Not as a complaint, as the fact. She noted it because she had learned that the facts you write down are the ones you can return to. The ones that tell you where you've been when you're trying to figure out how far you've come. In April, the formal charges against Calvin Hargrove were filed in federal court. The charges included land acquisition fraud, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy to manipulate federal infrastructure planning. Webb faced parallel charges in Kansas City. The Railroad Commission clerk was indicted in Topeka. The Caldwell paper ran the story on the front page. Eleanor read the article at the kitchen table the morning it appeared, and when she was done, she set the paper down and was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" Thomas asked. Eleanor considered the question. "I feel like it took too long," she said, "for the families who sold before we could stop it." "Yes," Thomas said, "and I feel like it was the right thing," she said, "to do it the way we did, through evidence, through records, through the kind of documentation that doesn't leave room for argument." "Your grandmother's method," Thomas said. Eleanor looked at him. She had told him that once, months ago, in the early dark of the kitchen, talking about the woman who had taught her that nothing was wasted and everything could be made to count. She had not expected him to remember it that way, filed under her grandmother's name. "Yes," she said, "her method." Clara McCready came to dinner that evening. She came, she said, to celebrate, which was a word Eleanor had not heard Clara use before, and which sounded slightly foreign in her mouth, as if she was trying it out for the first time and deciding whether she liked it. They sat at the kitchen table. Thomas, Eleanor, Clara, Walt Greer, Terrence Pratt, and Danny Croft, who was there because Walt had invited him, and who sat very straight in his chair and was careful with his manners in a way that made Eleanor privately fond of him. The table was full of food. The kitchen was warm. Clara raised her coffee cup. "To the woman," she said, who looked at a supply ledger and saw a crime. Eleanor shook her head. "I looked at numbers that didn't add up," she said. "That's what I said," Clara told her. Walt Greer raised his cup without speaking, which was as much ceremony as Walt ever committed to. Terrence raised his cup. Danny Croft raised his cup and then said earnestly, "And the bread. I want can we also raise it for the bread? Because genuinely it changed my life." which caused Clara McReady to laugh her real laugh again, and Thomas to catch Eleanor's eye across the table, and Eleanor to look back at her husband in the lamplight of her own kitchen, and feel, somewhere below, all the practicality and the work and the careful documentation of everything that mattered, that she had built something real, not just the business, not just the legal case, not just the winter stores and the storage shed and the hotel contracts, and the 2 women who came 3 mornings a week and were learning to bake with the particular precision that turned ingredients into something worth paying for. She had built a life, out of a practical arrangement that nobody had expected anything from. Out of a man who had handed her a list of duties and told her to stay in her part of the house. Out of a kitchen she had never been welcomed into so much as pointed toward. She had taken all of it, every limitation, every dismissal. Every morning she had gotten up before dawn in a house where no one had yet decided to respect her, and she had built something with it that was undeniably, permanently hers. That was the thing about Eleanor Brooks Whitaker that people in Caldwell came to understand over the years that followed. Not just that she was smart, though she was. Not just that she was capable, though she was capable in ways that continued to surprise people who thought they had already accounted for her. It was that she had known her own worth before anyone else in that town did, and she had gone right on building while they were still making up their minds about her. Years later, when people asked Thomas Whitaker how his ranch had survived the hardest winter of his life and come through the spring stronger than it had been in a decade, he never mentioned Hargrove by name. He never talked about the federal investigation, or the evidence, or the county officials who lost their positions. He always said the same thing. "My wife," he said. "My wife saved it." And when they pressed him, when they asked what exactly she had done, what skills or knowledge had made the difference, Thomas would look at them with the particular patience of a man who has learned that most answers worth giving cannot be compressed into a sentence, and he would say, "She showed me that a home is not kept by one person. It is built by 2 people who decide every morning to stay." And Eleanor, who was always somewhere nearby when he said it, in the kitchen, or on the porch, or walking back from the storage shed with her ledger under her arm, would hear those words and feel them land in the place where they always landed. Not with surprise, with the quiet, unshakable satisfaction of a woman who had known all along what she was worth, and had simply waited for the right man to be brave enough to know it too. Eleanor Brooks Whitaker was never just the woman who kept his house. She was the woman who built everything worth keeping.